This is Theodore Teddy Grant, a father to 3 beautiful children, husband to a loving wife, and brother to 4 caring siblings. Mr. Grant was on a long business trip to provide for his family. He was described to be a kind and successful man with a passion for community service and philanthropy. Mr. Grant was supposed to quickly finish his trip and come back safely to the arms of his family, but he never got the opportunity. He will never get the chance to kiss his children goodnight, hug his wife, and laugh with his family. You will not get to meet Teddy Grant. I will never get the chance to meet Teddy Grant because he was murdered. He was murdered by his friend, the defendant, Sterling Jackson. Mr. Grant met Mr. Jackson while traveling on his trip, and they quickly became companions as they were traveling in the same direction. They stopped at a nearby inn, Brookstone Inn, at the recommendation of Mr. Jackson, since he frequently travels along the path. Some people in the inn thought they looked like an odd pair. Mr. Grant dressed like he had money, while Mr. Jackson's clothes were worn out and homely. Witnesses saw them enjoy dinner together and share a bottle of rum and 2 glasses of whiskey, both bought by Mr. Grant. Both content and full from their meal, they steadily stumbled back to the same room to rest for the night. The innkeeper, Mr. Woodworth, briefly passed the room in the hallway after dinner and heard shouting and cursing, but decided that it was better to let them handle their problems. The next morning, the innkeeper rose to wake the guests for breakfast and found the gentlemen weren't responding to his knocking. He gently opened the door and was filled with horror at the sight of Mr. Grant's lifeless body, among the bloody bed sheets, with several stab wounds in his chest that resembled a sword wound. He noticed that Mr. Jackson had disappeared. Mr. Woodworth called for help, and many of the inn's patrons quickly tracked down Mr. Jackson as he was leaving town. Upon discovering him, they noticed he carried a long sword. They quickly grabbed the weapon and unsheathed it, and discovered that it was stained with blood, Mr. Grant's blood. But what really is terrifying is that this isn't the first murder to happen at the Brookstone Inn. About 1 year ago, a wealthy man and woman were killed in their apartment, both with sword wounds. And it just so happened that during the murders, all the patrons staying at the inn that time were questioned, including Mr. Jackson. Is it just a coincidence or something more sinister? That shouting and cursing in that room that night? Angry outbursts tend to be quite common when 2 men become intoxicated, an emotional state that is hard to control, and our actions become so affected that we begin to act irrationally. Whatever argument they had, their anger was amplified and their emotions began to swirl out of control. We've all seen the dangers of alcohol and the change of character that comes with it. The impulse of our actions in a few seconds, without any regard of the consequences that could last a lifetime. Intoxication is a drug that blinds all reason as our emotions take over. Mr. Jackson had a weapon at hand, and just a few whacks, and it would be all over and the argument would end. The feeling of being the big, strong man, a loser in the eyes of the world with no money or success, gaining the upper hand against a man who had it all. It had to be exhilarating for Mr. Jackson. Not to mention, he claimed that he didn't do it and that he called out to Mr. Grant and received no response, so he went on his way. But how do you not hear someone be stabbed in the bed right next to you? How do you not see the blood-stained sheets? Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, let me first thank you for your time and attention this evening. Before you begin your deliberations, please remember the testimony of the witnesses, the facts of the case that proves to you beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant is in fact guilty of murdering Mr. Grant on impulse.